Sweet baby.
Why is it spinning? Oh, okay. Oh, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Penny in Action Coalition's continuing book discussion series on The Line Becomes a River by Francisco Cantu. We are well into our discussion of part 3 of the book now, and we have 7 pages of comments from our illustrious organizers of this event. They send me their thoughts ahead of time, and I read those out for the folks listening at home, and hopefully to spur discussion in the comments. But I think 7 pages might be a record so far. So we will try our best to get through most of these thoughts from our organizer friends and see who joins us. Today's theme, as conceived by our partner and friend Claudia, is the loss of identity and self / dehumanization. It's a major theme of this book about the immigration crisis, and this is something that's come up in an oblique way in our discussion several times already over the past several weeks. Identity has been a major theme of this book, how people see themselves and others and how they are seen by others. And so now this is the logical flip side of that. And a lot of our conversations have taken into account sort of parallels between the magnitude of the immigration crisis and the potential for dehumanization that comes along with that, paralleled to the current coronavirus pandemic and the magnitude of that issue and the potential for dehumanization. And we've tied it back to things like the Holocaust, just these major world events where there's been major loss of life, and it's really easy to get lost in a sense of just these nameless, faceless victims, and the importance of trying to keep thinking of them as fellow human beings who suffered unjustly and are no longer with us. So Claudia writes, in the previous parts of the book, we discussed the importance of identity. In this part, the loss of identity becomes a recurring theme. According to Cantú and the authorities he cites, what are some of the things that lead to an individual or group of individuals being stripped of their identities, their sense of self, their objectification, and their ultimate dehumanization? How can we reverse that? How can we turn numbers and others back into people? And one of the cool things that happens in the conversations that go on behind the scenes before we get to these live Facebook Live sessions, all of our Penny in Action Coalition organizing committee folks send me their thoughts, and a lot of times they do the whole reply all thing, so everybody is seeing all of the comments ahead of time. And sometimes they become little virtual conversations themselves. Sometimes people kind of all have their own separate thoughts, but other times their thoughts kind of go together and one responds to another, either intentionally or not. This time there happened to be a lot of intentional responding to one another. So in order to capture that, rather than in the past how I've just kind of gone through each person's response and just read it straightforwardly and added my own little commentary and brought in any commentary that folks here on the Facebook Live session bring in, I have tried to kind of splice the conversations together so that, you know, if one person raises a notion and another person responded to that, I'm going to try to link those together. Hopefully it'll work and won't be too confusing. As usual, our good friend Cindy, I really like how she sets the tone. She's usually the first one to get her comments in, and she has a variety of comments. Some things that address Claudia's theme and questions directly, some things that are more her own personal observations, and she often has a way of framing her responses that are really beneficial, I think. So today she started by saying, as I was reading over the topics for discussion in part 3, I thought, what have I been a part of for 4 years? Have I been a part of something for 4 years? How have I been changed for being part of that something? Did I think about whether or not I would be changed as a result of the experience? Did I think about being an observer rather than a participant? The word spy came to me a second ago. To be an observer would be to be like a spy, gathering information. Perhaps we would find value in thinking about the above. And I think that observation comes from the notion that perhaps Cantú spent 4 years in the Border Patrol, and these questions of whether or not he was changed by that experience are key to this text. And I think that it's evident from the fact that he wrote this memoir about his time there that he certainly acted in that information gathering capacity. I'm going to go a little bit out of order here of Cindy's comments because of the way various folks' responses came in. So I'll jump over a little bit here and go into Cindy's observation. Another thought that came to me after reading over the discussion topics was, I think that Cantú would have gone to see his dying mother in Mexico as Jose did. Cindy thinks that this seems like a good thing to do. People who have regard for their family connections would certainly consider doing this. But with what results for Jose? Would Cantú or Jose make such a visit to the bedside of their mother if they knew the results for them? And in Jose's case, the result of that must have been perhaps his deportation. This is the part in every session where I, again, admit before all this pandemic stuff happened, I didn't get a chance to get a copy of the book, so I am not currently reading it. So sometimes I'm making little inferences. If any of you out there wonder what I'm talking about and I'm wrong about something, correct me. But it seems to me that this decision on Jose's part to go and visit his mother in Mexico resulted in negative results for him. So that's a good question. Cindy thinks Cantu that same decision. And asks us whether that's something that we would do, whether we would take that risk knowing that something very negative could befall us. Cindy goes on, page 169 and 170. Jose started a conversation with Cantú asking why he would give up a job with La Migra. Cantú was making good money with La Migra. It wasn't the work for me, says Cantú. I avoided his eyes, thinking of what more to add. Finally, I looked up at him. I wanted to go back to school, I said, study writing, earn a master's degree. Cindy continues, when we look into a person's eyes, we are looking into his or her soul. Did Cantú avoid Jose's eyes because he did not want to have his soul revealed? The schooling, the writing, the master's degree, how did Jose process those desires of Cantú's? Were they foreign to him, something that never would have occurred to him? Were these two men so different, wanting such different things that they could not connect? Or are they so much alike that Cantú had to write this memoir? And that's that question of looking into one's eyes and seeing into someone's soul. We have a couple of responses to that idea from some of the other Penyan Action Coalition members. So Mickey says, I think I'll use Cindy's thoughts to spur my own. And she reiterates Cindy's last sort of question there. And Mickey goes on to say, when I read this, I remember thinking that we all come with experiences, and that creates a paradigm, a viewpoint. I thought that because of his circumstances, Jose would never have thought of school, especially at the graduate level. For him, the best he could hope for was a job to provide for his family and a loving family surrounding him in a place of safety. And he had that and was happy, but eventually willing to take a risk to see his dying mother, a testament to his strong love and connection and commitment to family. But Cantú has a broader range of possibilities and knows it. Thus his unwillingness to look him in the eye. And I think especially when he's talking to Jose, he has still not confronted all the issues of his Border Patrol work. but in the end he writes, and in the writing of the book wrestles with them, and says he could write much more because he has seen so much more. An intro to invite us to listen to the videos of his interviews. And that's an excellent plug from Mickey for some resources that we have for you. If you haven't seen them already, I shared again to our Facebook page yesterday, and they should still be towards the top of that. The further reading list that Claudia put together, which now includes a couple of video interviews, like Mickey says, with Cantu. So certainly, if you want to continue on with Cantu's experience, those videos would be a great place to start. And there's all kinds of other scholarly books, nonfiction books, novels, young adult books, graphic novels from a variety of writers, all treating the issue of the immigration crisis. So I recommend that you take a look at those if you haven't already. Continuing on with that conversation about point of view, perspective, Ed also chimed in on that topic. When Cantu wrote this book, he was young. In later writings by him, he indicates his naivete about border life and its ramifications. In some of these magazines, Harper's, etc., where Cantu has written, Cantu received some objections to his book and notoriety over it, especially by other Latino writers, some of whom escaped other countries and came over the US border and lived what he wrote about. They basically say Cantu is privileged, didn't live some of which he wrote about, didn't stay at the border to help. And Cantu has acknowledged that some of what his critics say is true and attribute some of that, but not all of it to his youth. So that's an interesting continuation of that notion that we all have our own personal paradigm, as Mickey puts it, but certainly that paradigm can shift over time as well as we age and have further experiences. And I think it's certainly within the rights of other writers and observers to criticize Cantu for the limitations of his perspective and what he writes about. But it's to Cantu's credit that he acknowledges his privilege and has continued writing on the subject. And hopefully has shown growth as time has gone by. The writing world, the literary world, is really much more of a rough and tumble place than people give it credit for. I think people think of authors and publishers and editors and all this as fairly genteel sorts of people who always engage just with the greatest of civility and regard for propriety. But there can be some pretty intense dust-ups between writers of different backgrounds or writers who perceive another to be claiming backgrounds that perhaps they should not. You might have followed the recent news right around around the time of the new year with the book American Dirt and a lot of the controversy that came out surrounding that book. Also a work of fiction about border and immigration issues. But there was a great deal of controversy about that author's authenticity to be writing that story. And greater than that, perhaps the publishing industry's complicity in affording a voice and a position to someone who's basically white, non-Latino, and there was some question about her grandmother and all this stuff that could have given her some credibility. But basically the publishing industry saw this woman who was essentially a white American woman and gave her a platform to talk about immigration issues. While there are a myriad of Latin American authors with a great deal more authenticity who don't get the six-figure advance and the huge marketing blitz and the 27-city tour and all this stuff. So the writing world is not for the faint of heart, and Cantu seems to have experienced that as well. Okay, let's see here. Going all the way back to Cindy with a few more remarks over here. Cindy writes that Cantu says, quote, Writing seemed like a good way to make sense of what I'd seen. Jose considers this. I could write many books. Visto muchas cosas. I have seen many things. Is Spanish used here to suggest that Jose will be seeing through the eyes of a Mexican? In the same passage, Cantu and Jose, quote, lapse into talking some Spanish to each other. Is it because they are connecting on a deeper level? And this question of what role the use of the Spanish language plays in this text has come up since our very first in-person meeting when we started our discussions of this book, and all the various shades of meaning that can be inferred from Cantu's choice to insert Spanish into an otherwise English language piece of writing. And I invite all of you out there listening and having your own thoughts to tell us what you think the significance of some of those Spanish passages may be. Cindy's interpretation is that it is an indication of greater intimacy between these two men. Perhaps you have a different interpretation. Maybe other portions of Spanish have a different meaning. Cindy refers to a joke that Jose tells on pages 170 and 171, and that it's disturbing to her. She did not copy the joke over, so I don't know what the substance of that joke is. But she says, was Jose implying that Americans, Border Patrol agents, try by torturous means to get Mexican immigrants to confess that they are something that they are not? So if anyone has any insight into that joke, disturbing or otherwise, feel free to share your thoughts about that. And Cindy closes by saying, perhaps readers would want to comment on Cantu's writing style, how it advances the purpose of the memoir and other considerations. And that's another instance where some of our other contributors chimed in. So again, if you want to tackle this question, I'll repeat it. Perhaps readers would want to comment on Cantu's writing style, how it advances the purpose of the memoir and other considerations. So what do you think about Cantu's writing style? And for an illustration of what we mean, Claudia responded to that question. Claudia responds, so this is in response to the question about the author's writing style, and to whether the author and his friend are alike or too different to understand each other. At first, I thought the author jumped around a lot. That can be very disorienting for readers when a narrative is not linear. And you always have to wonder why an author chooses to do that. After multiple readings, I now believe his work is carefully crafted. The wolf motif, dreams, parables, and essays are woven throughout to make us realize that we have to face up to who we are, whether as an individual or as a nation, and that we need to acknowledge our guilt, our participation in the culture in which we are a part. Then we need to take steps to atone for those actions or inactions. Claudia continues, I believe it's clear Cantu has a lot of guilt, and I also think he recognizes our common humanity. We may speak different languages and come from different cultures, but we all have the same needs, desires, and emotions. That's what's wonderful about getting to know those who are different from us on a personal level. The differences fall away. I see Debbie has commented as well. His writing style is perfect for this book, lyrical, factual, beautiful, but disturbing. That certainly seems to be the consensus. It seems from Claudia's response that Cantu has a great deal of self-awareness. And despite the charges perhaps some of his critics made about his naivete and his privilege, he seems to be someone gifted with the right kind of headspace to recognize his faults, and perhaps not his faults, but his whatever his limitations at a given time may be, and to work on improving them over time. And a lot of times that is the purpose of writing a memoir, writing at all, is to work through things that we're not, consciously able to work through in our day-to-day interactions. But by writing this memoir, perhaps Cantu has advanced. Once he recognized a need to advance, the writing of this may have helped in that regard. Okay, that's the only response on that count that I had. So again, if any of the rest of you have thoughts about the writing style, please do share that in the comments. Let's see. So now I'll go back to the first point Cindy had, because there was a lot of response to this idea. And it's another sort of, it's not specific to this issue, but again, it's drawing a parallel between our reading of this book and a larger current event issue that we're all dealing with. So Cindy wrote, I have CBS on the TV while I'm sitting here at the kitchen table. There was a segment about sharing personal stories about people who have died from COVID-19, putting a human face on a statistic. How many personal stories have we heard about the immigrants trying to get to the US? And this is returning to a theme we have touched on multiple times throughout our discussions. That lack of humanity inherent in letting individuals get lost in the mass of victims, of losses. So that's a great point. And I think it's really wonderful that there's this move to tell stories about the victims of COVID-19. But I think Cindy's question is cogent. How many personal stories have we heard about the immigrants trying to get to the US? And you can certainly find such stories. There are some out there, but I think it is, I can't think of one off the top of my head. And I follow this kind of thing fairly closely. So I think that tells us a lot about the priorities of the stories that get told in our culture. And I think the unfortunate thing is, the first thing that comes to my mind, even in my posture of disagreeing with it vehemently, but when I think of the immigration issue and I think of the people who are those immigrants, almost invariably, the thing that seared into my mind is a certain someone talking about how they're rapists and killers, and certainly some of them are very fine people. That has been so inextricably linked with my thoughts about the issue, and I'm sure it has with so many others as well, whether they're people who buy into that very dangerous and unhelpful kind of talk, or people like me who know it to be gibberish and nonsense and reject it outright. But that's, as far as personal stories go, that's the first thing that comes to mind. It's not personal, but it's the way the issue is being personified as this negative thing, and I think that's horrible. So Cindy asked the question. We have some response to it from some of the other folks. Going back to Mickey's comments. So she says, Cindy starts referencing the TV piece about sharing personal stories about people who have died from COVID-19, putting a human face on a statistic. How many personal stories have we heard about the immigrants trying to get to the US? And Mickey brings up something that's also on that resource of further reading. At her and Ed's suggestion, I included a link to this that she's referring to, that there is a map created to ID each body/remains found near the border in the Phoenix area as a way to personalize the numbers. So again, that link to that map, the article about that map is on that reading list. It's at the very bottom. I added it to the bottom. So again, you can find that on the Penny in Action Coalition Facebook page timeline. I shared it yesterday sometime. Mickey goes on, be warned, it's hard to look at and to think about. As told by Cantú, not all bodies are retrieved or investigated. Families may never know what has happened to their loved ones. How hard is that? It's terrible. Mickey continues, what has always gnawed on my soul is the question, how desperate must one be to try to cross a desert in Mexico, in Syria, in Africa, when the outcome can be death? And even scarier, what must you be fleeing if you do that with a child? We have no concept of that. We are so privileged. Even in this pandemic, we have options. The poorer parts of our city start out with poorer health and limited access to care. They are dying in larger numbers than the wealthy, who are stronger and healthier for all the reasons that their wealth provides. And that, we hear that question in immigration rights circles. How desperate must you be to attempt this dangerous passage? And I know there's it's nuanced, and there's a lot of complicated answers to that question. It's not as simple necessarily as that, but considering that the response from others about the crisis is simply follow the law and get in line, I think there's a deep lack of morality in framing the question that way. Whereas if we frame the question as, why are these people doing this? We get at a much more moral answer to the problem. We start from a place of compassion for what they're going through as people, and they're not merely lawbreakers, illegals, a statistic of entities attempting to jump our fence. And I think that to dehumanize and to de-identify human beings is an immoral position, and that you have to start with the question of why would people do this and try to understand that. I do see some comments coming in over here. Debbie says all the refugees, so Debbie and a few other folks, Peggy and Anne, have gone down to the border. Annunciacion House, is that what it's called? I'm sorry if I'm getting that wrong. But it's an organization helping people who've crossed the border. And so Debbie says all the refugees we met with in El Paso and Juarez were families with children, most under the age of 10. Everyone was fleeing drug cartel violence. They were lovely, intelligent, compassionate, honest people. Cantú represents the refugees honestly. And Peggy adds, Anne, Debbie, and I can say that one family we met in El Paso is now in New Hampshire, and another family is supposed to come to New Hampshire soon. We met these families and are encouraged they have found a place of refuge. So these are folks who have firsthand interaction with actual human beings crossing the border. They're not just relying on news reports. They're not just relying on, whatever biased source they choose to read. I give them huge credit and respect for going down there and meeting people, helping people, learning about people, and bringing their stories back to us. And if you haven't seen one of their live presentations they've given around the community, hopefully someday soon we'll be able to hold another one of those, and you should all come and see them. Mickey says, plus one of our reasons for being is to explain that there isn't really a line to get into because we have made it so. That's a great point. In some of our informational sessions, members of the group were way more up on the legal facts of this issue than I am, who have studied this and keep up on all the little changes and minutia of the actual legal process for crossing the border. Have reiterated strongly that there is no line, there is no orderly procession that you can get in, on day one, and maybe by day 5 you're magically in to be considered a lawful resident of the United States. It's complicated, it's hard, it's difficult, and it has been intentionally designed that way. And I touched on that in our last session, I think, where maybe a couple of times ago, where I basically reminded us all that we have decided that this is the way things are for our own personal, political, maybe some kind of moral stand, we have decided that there's this line in the sand that some people get to cross and most people don't, and that somehow that's the way it has to be. And as I remind you, all boundaries are conventions. It's all what we decide that they are. We don't have to make it disappear. There can be a system in place, but why, oh, why does it have to be so hard and unimaginably, callously cruel and immoral? Sorry. Okay. Continuing. All right. And then, so continuing on that theme, Ed said that immigrant deaths and coronavirus deaths become a number unless you know of someone personally. And this gets back to Debbie and Anne and Peggy's incredible personal interactions with people. Ed refers to also the map of immigrant deaths. He's the one who found the article about it and shared it with us. Go to the article I sent some of you about the map of immigrant deaths that have been cataloged in some cases by name, GPS coordinates of where they died, sex, and how they died if known, etc. It is sobering. The best place to find some of Cantu's other articles, including the map, is by going to the Whiting Foundation and searching for Francisco Cantu. I linked that all in the resource page. And also some info about him is found in Harper's Magazine, Guernica, and Best American Essays. So all places that you can find more by and about Cantu. Excuse me, getting a little hoarse here. Oh, we're already over the half-an-hour mark. I think we're close to being finished. I did get a comment from, we've got some Scarlett here, and I know Scarlett's with us. So I don't want to skip Scarlett. She's kind of continuing that same discussion about these, the recommended readings. So she says, today I looked at a couple of links recommended by Action Coalition members. In one, I read of the destruction of food and water supplies and the pervasive attitude of dismissal and neglect. Humanity is physically threatened with no food or water available, and emotionally/mentally threatened by being dismissed or neglected as if one is worth nothing. So on the one hand, you have the destruction of sources of physical life, and on the other hand, you have destruction of sources of mental and emotional well-being, and both of these things are being inflicted on people crossing the border. We need sustenance at many levels to feel that our humanity is valued and supported. In another, this one written by Cantú, he referred to, quote, clearly marked ghosts, an article. Mickey refers to this article when she comments on the map showing dots that mark where bodies have been found. Cantú writes that to merely make a dot or some mark does not give identity to the person who died. The person becomes just another dot, another number, a ghost, and these ghosts haunt us. Cantú wrote in this article, quote, more important than mapping the death is preserving the names of those who have died and finding right ways of holding them. One answer to Claudia's question about how we turn numbers into people, Scarlett continues, is that we learn and remember people's stories. As we go about our daily lives, we need to listen to and learn the stories of the people with whom we've come in contact, friends, families, strangers. I too saw the program that Cindy mentioned, the stories of the people who have died from coronavirus. So we're capable of doing this. We're doing it now with the unfolding crisis. We need to do it for the immigration crisis. We need to do it for the global refugee crisis. We need to do it for the HIV/AIDS crisis. We need to do it for the crisis of the brutal killings of trans people, particularly trans women of color. We need to know their names and we need to know their stories. I had a nice stretch of comments from Debbie. I got these late in the game. I hadn't checked my email right before signing on here, and then I checked my email and I had this waiting for me from Debbie. So I didn't have a chance to preview this, so if she responded to some of those previous questions or not, I'm not sure, but let's see what she said. So again, yes, okay, Debbie's one of those three who has gone down to the border. And she says, after rereading Cantu's book and rereading the Marine/border agent's interview, and that's referring to an opportunity our group had to ask some questions of a young man. He was not a Border Patrol agent, but a Marine who was stationed at the border. And we asked him some questions, and he very kindly and anonymously responded. So after rereading that and Cantu's book, Debbie says, I am deeply struck by the similarity between the two men, okay, Cantu and this Marine. I am also struck with their similarity with Ramon Garcia, founder and current CEO of Annunciation House in El Paso, Juarez, and the immigration attorneys and other experts we met and talked with in El Paso. They are all saying the same thing, which was succinctly expressed by the Marine. To quote, how much of the border issue was created by the US government/business lobby over the last X decades will not be fixed by just a physical wall. As long as there is a massive market for drugs in the US, a need for labor, and a cheap renewable resource for it, the US is likely its own worst enemy, not only causing the issues, but paying for it as well. And at the end of the day, poor people are suffering the consequences of extreme poverty and dying along the way, trying to reach it or paying to get across, creating a business of its own. He goes on to say that the, quote, cycle just keeps repeating itself at the southern border, just like it is all over the world where we are involved. That's stark and cutting for sure. And I can't see how it's inaccurate. That sounds fairly accurate to me. In these, facile chants of build the wall and it's all gonna be magically okay are just, there's an actual, plank in one of our major political parties in this country that just says build that wall, and I'm sure they have something behind that, but they know that the simple slogan, the bumper sticker, is what gins up the American people's anger towards, revulsion towards, hatred towards the other, the people who are coming here to mess with our lives, and we have to do something about them. And it's just if they know better and they continue to parrot these facile quote unquote solutions, they're guilty of moral abnegation beyond my ability to describe. I'm getting way too political today. I'm sorry. It's Friday. It's late. I'm stressed out by the world. Yeah. Anyway. Okay. Debbie goes on. Cantu is haunted by the innocence and pathos of the people he meets, as well as the wrongdoing of our government's actions. There are thousands of Jose's and families like Jose's. The border agents and court judges/judicial system are just following orders, but become hardened by cruelty. But he knows there can be a different outcome. She refers to the parable of the wolf that we have discussed in previous sessions. He knows he made the right decision to leave because he can do more good as a writer, but he feels very, very guilty, I think, and feels he deserted the refugees. And that's interesting given what we heard earlier about other writers and other people with experience on the border criticizing him. I'm sure he already felt guilty enough about it, but it's true sometimes, we're seeing during this pandemic that one of our greatest gifts and resources is art. And sometimes your role is to create art, whether to comfort or to expose. And that the exposure is a very powerful tool. And that seems to be what Cantú has focused on. Debbie continues, Ramon Garcia, the CEO of Annunciation House, stressed that the border agents aren't to blame. They are just following orders. We touched on that a little bit last week. The policies and laws need to change by passing a comprehensive immigration plan, similar to the McCain-Kennedy bill proposed in 2005. Properly fund it and effectively monitor how the money is spent. This could have been done many years ago. It can still be done, but until true problems are addressed, violence and pathos will increase. I know little about that bill, but I am sure that it involves more than just build that wall. And it seems to have been a bipartisan proposal. Fancy that. Debbie continues, Cantú was a border agent during the Bush and Obama administrations. Jose's tragic saga occurred during the Obama administration. He published his book in 2018 in the Trump administration. Cartel violence and immigration problems have more than doubled in the 1.5 years since it was published. The situation, as the Marine pointed out, is worldwide. Remember, this is Debbie talking. I've had the opportunity to talk with Lydia, who has recently returned from 6 weeks volunteering with refugees and immigrants on the island of Lesbos. This was her second trip. Her experience was very intense as she lived in Lesbos camp. The situation is deeply desperate. In our experience, almost 100% of refugees that we met, worked and talked with in El Paso and Juarez were families with children. Families were of different economic means and different nationalities and backgrounds, but all were fleeing for their lives from drug cartel violence. It disturbs me greatly that I will never know what happened to those lovely children and families. This book and support materials have been a very emotional read for me, Debbie says, and she greatly appreciates the work we have done. If I had read this ahead of time, I would have left out the I'm not trying to pat ourselves on the back here, but thank you, Debbie, and we appreciate your work as well and your assistance with all this. And I think I have just one more comment to share from Nancy. Nancy says, I have been reading your remarks, everyone, and it gives her great insight and thought to the book's conclusions. I saved this for the end here because it's like Cindy's initial sort of framing device at the beginning of this conversation. This is another sort of good frame comment to sort of end on. It's a little bit, it's not necessarily directly responsive to the theme that Claudia set out for today, but it's more of a holistic observation. So Nancy says, this is what I just read in a Richard Rohr daily meditation. Quote, walking through one's fear of the last thing becomes an encounter with the first thing. A person is then free to live, often for the first time outside of their head or their fear. Death encounters seem to be the primary way to build or rebuild a real life. Then life itself, in all its depth and beauty, becomes the unquestionable gift. End quote. I'm going to read that again. Bear with me because it's densely packed. It's a Richard Rohr daily meditation. Walking through one's fear of the last thing becomes an encounter with the first thing. A person is then free to live, often for the first time outside of their head or their fear. Death encounters seem to be the primary way to build or rebuild a real life. Then life itself, in all its depth and beauty, becomes the unquestionable gift. And Nancy says, this goes back and addresses the fear theme discussed in other sessions. Is Cantú trying to be free to have a chance to rebuild a life he lost from pre-border patrol? The death encounter with coronavirus may be a good example to relate our fears and realize the numbers to those involved on all sides of the border issue. So we're having a death experience as a society. And I like the meditation that Nancy included. I can't say that I have an authoritative interpretation of it, but in my personal gnosis, my personal religious path, I believe in the power of what occurs in liminal spaces, that is, the spaces between one thing and the next, one state and the next, one form of existence and the next. And I think that's what this meditation is getting at. And I think when we come to a death encounter, it's not always literal. Society itself probably isn't going to die, but it is nonetheless a death encounter, a liminal space between our comfortable life as we lived it before and whatever is going to come next. And right now we're in this space in between where everything's up in the air, everything is possible. And that's where we can come to greater understandings of issues that have vexed us for a long time. So I think taking this opportunity to more fully realize, as Nancy says, the numbers of those involved on all sides of the border issue, it's sort of a blessing in disguise that we get to grapple with, or not, as our personal tastes may be. And some of us may not be in a place to do that. Thus ends the 7 pages of comments that I had here and all of my silly little interludes. We've already gone 45 minutes. I usually try to stick to half an hour on these, so I am going to shut up and thank you for contributing. Thank you to the Pena and Action Coalition members for sending me all those amazing thoughts. I do hope, folks, even if you are not commenting, I hope that if you're coming here through the emails that Mickey sends out, or if you find us on Facebook through whatever means, that you are listening with an open heart and are considering your reactions to what we have to say, to the book, if you're reading it, to this whole border issue that is one of the great challenges of our nation in this time, and indeed of the world. We'll be back at it on Monday with yet another discussion. I hope some of you will be there for us. All right. Keep commenting. You can continue commenting even after we end the live video. The floor is yours. Thanks and have a great weekend, everybody.